Classical Music Mysteries. December 5th, 1791. It was around 1 a.m. in an apartment on Rauhensteingasse in Vienna. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart breathed his last. He was just 35 years old. Beside him lay the handwritten manuscript for his Mass for the Dead, the Requiem. But the score was left incomplete. Only the opening section, the introitus, was fully orchestrated. From the Kyrie onward, instrumental parts were missing. Often only the vocal lines and the bass notes were jotted down. And then, at a certain point, the writing simply stops. You might know the scene from the movie Amadeus or other creative works. A messenger in black foretells his death. A terrified Mozart writes frantically, coughing up blood. But that image is a dramatic fiction born of romanticism. The reality was much colder. It was a mundane, calculated business transaction. Why did he write this piece? Why did the composer's name have to be hidden? And how did this unfinished work finally reach completion? Today, we will uncover the true identity of the mysterious client behind this masterpiece. We will also reveal the full story of the cover-up orchestrated by Mozart's widow. Chapter 1: The Identity of the Client. In the summer of 1791, an anonymous commission arrived for Mozart. The sender was an aristocrat. His name was Count Franz von Walseck-Stuppach, whose estate lay just outside Vienna. The Count was a passionate music lover. He played the cello and the flute, but he had a peculiar obsession. He desperately wanted people to believe he was a brilliant composer. In late 18th century Europe, music was a symbol of aristocratic refinement. Composing and performing your own work was a major status symbol. Count Walseck chose to buy this prestige. He repeatedly engaged in what we would call ghostwriting contracts today. He would anonymously commission works from first-rate composers. Once he received the scores, he meticulously copied them by hand. Then he hid the originals. Finally, he would present the music at private concerts, pretending he had written it himself. In February 1791, the Count lost his beloved wife, Anna. She was only 20 years old. To mark the first anniversary of her death, he planned a grand gesture. He would present a top-tier Requiem, claiming it as his own. To ghostwrite this masterpiece, he chose Mozart. At the time, Mozart was famous in Vienna, but he was plagued by chronic financial troubles. The Count didn't just want beautiful music, he needed absolute perfection. The piece had to be flawless enough to guarantee his reputation as a master composer without raising any suspicion. This twisted vanity was the spark. It became the very first motive behind the most famous unfinished masterpiece in music history. Chapter 2: The True Face of the Messenger in Black. A messenger in black is said to have visited Mozart, plunging him into a fear of death. In legend, this figure is a metaphor for the Grim Reaper, but historical records reveal something far more ordinary. His true identity was entirely practical and administrative. The messenger's name was Anton Leitgeb. He was an earnest steward tasked with managing Count Walseck's estate. Following the Count's orders, Leitgeb presented Mozart with a commission, but it came with strict conditions of anonymity. The offered fee was 100 ducats in total. For Mozart at the time, this was an incredibly generous sum. The terms were clear. Mozart must never reveal himself as the composer, and the client would have full freedom to use the work however he wished. Reading Mozart's letters from this period reveals his desperate situation. He'd lived lavishly since the late 1780s. His wife, Constanza, required frequent and expensive medical care, and his income as a freelance musician was highly unstable. Hiding his name surely wounded his pride as an artist, but he had no choice. He accepted the terms, he received an advance payment of 50 ducats upon signing, and he began to write. Many biographies claim Mozart saw this commission as an omen of his own death, leaving him terrified. But objective documents tell a different story. They show the anxiety of a professional craftsman racing to meet a strict deadline. To Mozart, this man in black wasn't a messenger of fate. He was just an errand boy for a cold, calculating client holding the rest of his paycheck. Chapter 3: Delays and Desperation. The year 1791 was the busiest of Mozart's life. When he received the Requiem commission, he was already juggling massive projects. He was collaborating with Schikaneder on the opera The Magic Flute. Then an urgent commission arrived for the opera The Clemency of Titus, for the coronation of Leopold II as King of Bohemia. Add to that a clarinet concerto, shorter pieces, and music for the Freemasons. Managing his deadlines was an absolute nightmare. Surviving records paint a chaotic picture. Mozart was writing opera scores inside a carriage on his way to Prague. After returning to Vienna, he was sketching out the Requiem from his sickbed. But illness was ravaging his physical body. Modern medicine suggests he likely suffered from rheumatic fever or a severe infection. Whatever it was, the disease pushed him to his physical limits. By late November, Mozart was completely bedridden. What's remarkable here is the state of his handwritten manuscript. The opening introitus is fully orchestrated. Every instrument is perfectly noted. The following Kyrie is also near completion, but the sections after that are mere skeletons. Only the choir and bass parts are filled out. And then comes the famous Lacrimosa. After just 8 bars of choral music, the pen completely stops. The final notes he ever wrote weren't a soaring violin melody or a grand chorus. They were just fragmented instructions. Chapter 4: The Widow's Gamble. On December 5th, Mozart took his final breath. His wife, Constanze, faced unimaginable grief, but she also faced a crushing practical crisis. She was left with massive debts. Her only asset was an unfinished manuscript, which promised a final payout of 50 ducats. If Count Walsegg discovered the piece was incomplete, he would demand his advance back. Her financial ruin would be absolute. Constanze made a bold, historic decision. She would secretly ask Mozart's students to finish the score. They would mimic their master's handwriting as closely as possible. Then she would deliver the piece to the Count, pretending Mozart had finished it before he died. Her first choice was Franz Xaver Eiblang. He was a composer highly respected by Mozart, but for reasons unknown, he abandoned the work halfway through. Next, she turned to Franz Xaver Süssmayr. He was a loyal student who had served Mozart devotedly in his final years. Süssmayr's task was grueling. He had to construct the latter half of the piece using only Mozart's fragmented sketches and ideas. Worse, he had to forge Mozart's handwriting throughout the entire manuscript. When you closely examine the final score delivered to the Count, you can see Süssmayr's painstaking efforts. He tried desperately to perfectly mimic his master's pen strokes. To seal the deception, Constanze forged Mozart's signature and the date on the title page. Ironically, she dated it 1792, a year after Mozart had already died. In 1792, this finished manuscript was handed over to Leybold, who delivered it to Count Walsegg. The Count was satisfied. He paid the remaining fee. Constanze's desperate gamble had worked, at least for the time being. Epilogue: The Two Surviving Originals. December 14th, 1793. Inside a church in Wiener Neustadt, south of Vienna, Count Walsegg premiered his new Requiem. The audience was deeply moved by the profound sorrow and sublime melodies. They likely believed it was the Count's own creation. But his stolen glory would not last long. Meanwhile, Constanza was already making her own moves. She knew the legal risks of violating the Count's contract, yet she organized successful public performances of the piece. She began distributing copies and preparing the score for publication. To her, this music was a sacred prayer mourning her husband, but it was also a powerful brand, one she needed to support her surviving family. When the sheet music was eventually published, the Count reportedly complained. He felt it was a breach of contract. But by then, Vienna was swarming with dramatic rumors. People whispered that Mozart was poisoned. They said he had written his final piece for the Grim Reaper itself. The public was absolutely captivated by the idea of Mozart's Requiem. As a result, the Count never took legal action. The issue quietly faded away. It's highly likely the Count feared a trial. A public lawsuit would have exposed his own secret, that he was passing off other men's music as his own. Today, the Austrian National Library in Vienna houses the delivery score once kept by the Count. Its cover bears Mozart's signature and the date, 1792. It stands as a physical testament to the complicated history behind this masterpiece. On the other hand, the bundle of Mozart's original manuscripts is hopelessly intertwined with Süssmayer's editions. Even today, scholars continue to debate the boundaries. Where does the spark of the master end, and where does the desperate labor of the student begin? Mozart's Requiem survived through an accumulation of deeply human, entirely worldly motives: one man's vanity, one woman's survival strategy, and one young composer's devotion to his master's legacy. When we listen to this music today, we shouldn't picture a terrified genius fearing death. Instead, we're hearing the breath of real people fighting through a harsh reality, struggling to pass down a musical legacy. When you peel away the myth, what remains is a testament that became eternal precisely because it was unfinished. Thank you for watching. If you have your own thoughts, theories, or interpretations, feel free to share them in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing for more content like this. See you in the next video.